The cabin was filled with a tense silence as the elderly man's hand struck Jordan across the face, the slap echoing through Flight 1742 like a gunshot. Shocked gasps filled the air, but no one moved. The young black teen sat frozen in his seat, tears welling up in his eyes as the sting of the slap burned across his cheek. The racist man sneered at him, calling him disrespectful, as if his very existence was an offense. But just when it seemed like the entire flight would let this injustice go unchallenged, a man in a business suit stood up. "That's enough," he said, his voice steady but filled with undeniable strength. The room went still as the stranger walked down the aisle, and in that moment, everything changed. What happened next would leave you speechless and inspire you to stand up when others won't. This is the moment when one voice turned the tide, but looks at some events that happened few hours earlier. The airport was alive with its usual hum, people rushing through security, children tugging at their parents' hands, announcements blaring over the speakers. Jordan Williams felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as he followed his mom through the crowded terminal. He was only 14, but this flight was supposed to be a big deal. They were headed to California, a trip to visit his aunt, where he could escape the monotony of schoolwork and just relax. "Jordan, do you have your headphones? And the snacks?" his mom asked, checking their bags one last time. "Yeah, Mom, I'm good," he replied with a grin, trying to ease her anxiety. She always worried when they flew. She'd always been the one who made sure everything was in order, whether it was his schoolwork or their travel plans. Today, though, everything was supposed to go smoothly. They were ready for their quiet journey across the country. The flight was packed. As they made their way down the narrow aisle, Jordan caught glimpses of the other passengers, some focused on their screens, others lost in conversations. It was all normal until they reached their seats. Jordan and his mom slid into their spots, stowing their bags overhead. The window seat was Jordan's favorite. He loved watching the planes taxi and take off. He was still trying to find a comfortable position when his elbow accidentally brushed the back of the seat in front of him. The man sitting there, an elderly white man with sharp features, immediately turned around, his eyes narrowing. Jordan froze. "Watch where you're putting your elbows, kid," the man muttered, his voice carrying just enough edge to make it clear he wasn't happy. Jordan glanced at his mom, hoping she hadn't noticed the tension, but she was already busy adjusting her seatbelt. The man's gaze lingered on Jordan for a moment longer than necessary before he huffed and turned back around. Jordan's heart skipped a beat, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd been flying enough to know people could be grumpy, but there was something about the way the man looked at him, something that felt different. Did I do something wrong? Jordan wondered, shifting his gaze to the window to avoid looking at the man again. He felt the unease settle in his stomach like a stone. Little did they know, this flight would change everything. The plane took off smoothly, the noise of the engines rising as the world below seemed to shrink. As the seatbelt signs turned off, passengers began to relax. Jordan put on his headphones and tried to immerse himself in the movie he'd been looking forward to watching. But the thought of the man's cold stare lingered in his mind, and every now and then he couldn't help but glance toward the row ahead of them. It was then that the man, Warren Caldwell, turned around again. This time, his eyes locked with Jordan's, and the corner of his mouth twisted into a condescending smile. "You know," Warren began, his voice low but clearly audible, "people like you just don't know how to act in public. All that energy, just can't sit still." Jordan blinked, unsure if he had heard that right. Was he imagining it? Or had the man really just made a comment about him like that? He looked at his mom, hoping she hadn't overheard, but she was distracted by the flight attendants coming through the aisle with drinks. She hadn't noticed the man's words. "Sorry, what did you say?" Jordan asked, not sure if he should have said anything at all. Warren smirked, not even bothering to look at him fully. "I said, kids like you don't know how to behave. Maybe you should be a little more respectful to the people around you." The sting of his words hit Jordan harder than he expected. He tried to brush it off. He's just a cranky old man, Jordan thought. It doesn't matter. But inside, something was beginning to bubble. "Excuse me, sir?" Jordan's mom said suddenly, her voice calm but firm. She had heard the exchange. She'd been trained by life to keep her cool. But something in her voice shifted as she spoke. Warren looked over at her, his expression barely shifting. "I'm just saying the boy needs to understand some manners." "Is that how you speak to kids?" "My son didn't do anything wrong," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The tension in the air thickened, and Jordan felt himself shrinking into the seat. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to be the reason his mom had to deal with this, but the words kept echoing in his mind. The man's words were like little jabs, hitting at something deeper, something Jordan hadn't realized he'd been feeling for years. The weight of being black in spaces where he didn't belong. He pulled his hoodie tighter, staring at the screen of his phone, wishing the moment would end. But it didn't. Warren's dismissive glance spoke volumes, and the rest of the cabin seemed to hold its breath. No one said a word. The air felt heavier than it ever had before. The flight attendant arrived, offering a drink to his mom, and the conversation died down. But the damage was done. Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that the incident wasn't over, that something worse was coming. Have you ever been made to feel small for something out of your control? Something you couldn't change, but that others judged you for anyway? Jordan didn't have an answer yet, but he would before this flight was over. The plane had leveled out at cruising altitude, the hum of the engines a constant presence as passengers settled into their routines. For Jordan, the discomfort from the earlier exchange with Warren lingered in the back of his mind. He tried to focus on the movie playing in front of him, but every time he glanced toward the man ahead, the anger in his eyes seemed to burn deeper into his soul. As Jordan fidgeted in his seat, trying to get comfortable, he accidentally brushed against Warren's arm again. This time, it wasn't a gentle nudge. It was more of an awkward misstep as the plane shifted slightly in turbulence. Jordan barely registered the movement before he felt it, a cold, hard glare piercing through him. Warren turned slowly, his face twisted with rage. The few seconds of silence felt like an eternity. Jordan's heart began to race, but before he could even react, Warren snapped. "God, you people can't even sit still without causing trouble," Warren spat, his voice now loud enough for the passengers nearby to hear. "Disrespectful little brat. Can't even keep your hands to yourself. Your kind never knows how to act in public." Jordan's face flushed with shame. His mind raced, and a mix of confusion and anger surged within him. He had been trying to let it go, to ignore the tension building with each word the man spoke. But now it felt different. The words cut deeper, stung harder. Was it really happening again? He could feel his fists tightening at his sides. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could even get a word out, Warren's face twisted in contempt. "You should be ashamed of yourself. You probably think you can get away with anything, huh? Just 'cause you're sitting here with your mother like some innocent little angel." The plane felt like it was closing in on him. The space suddenly too small, too tight. Jordan's mother, sitting beside him, had been trying to remain calm throughout this entire exchange, but now her face turned pale as Warren's words grew even more heated. She opened her mouth to say something, but it was too late. Jordan could already feel the tension building in his chest, the heat of injustice boiling over. Before anyone could intervene, Warren's hand shot out. The slap echoed through the cabin like a slap of thunder, so sudden and so shocking that it seemed to freeze the world around them. Jordan's head snapped to the side, the sting of the slap burning across his cheek, his vision blurring for a moment. The cabin went dead silent. Jordan's mom froze in shock, her face drained of color. She couldn't move, couldn't react, as the world seemed to tilt sideways. The passengers around them were frozen too. No one spoke, no one moved. The sound of the slap seemed to reverberate in the air, hanging there like a dark cloud. Jordan's cheek burned, but it wasn't just the physical sting. It was the humiliation, the disbelief, the utter wrongness of it all. A lump formed in his throat as he fought back the tears, his mind screaming for action, for someone, anyone, to do something. But everyone sat still. No one made a move. But that moment, that awful, crushing silence, was only the beginning. Little did Jordan know, this flight was about to take a turn that would forever change everything. The real fight was just beginning, one that would bring him face to face with something he could never have predicted. The silence after the slap was suffocating. The only sound was the soft hum of the airplane's engines and the occasional shuffle of feet as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The sting of the slap still burned in Jordan's cheek, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the humiliation he felt. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to hold back the tears. He couldn't understand how anyone could do something like that. His mom, still paralyzed in shock, reached for his hand, but Jordan pulled away, too overwhelmed to speak. She wanted to protect him, but it felt like nothing could undo what had just happened. The pain was both physical and emotional. Warren Caldwell sat there smugly, oblivious to the stunned silence around him. He adjusted his glasses, leaned back in his seat, and gave a self-satisfied chuckle. He didn't care. He didn't even seem to notice the eyes that were now fixed on him, the whispers spreading through the cabin. But then, the unexpected happened. A tall, middle-aged black man, Michael Kavach, stood up. Dressed in a well-tailored business suit, he moved toward the aisle with quiet confidence. His presence immediately drew the attention of the passengers. There was something about him, his posture, his calm but unwavering demeanor, that made the entire plane take notice. Jordan looked up through blurry eyes, barely able to process what was happening. Who was this man, and why was he standing up? Michael didn't hesitate. He walked down the aisle with purposeful strides, every step a promise of something he knew needed to be done. When he reached Warren's seat, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. "That's enough," Michael's voice rang out, cutting through the thick tension in the air. It was calm, but firm, and it carried the weight of someone who had seen too much injustice in his life to stay silent. Warren turned around, startled by the unexpected confrontation. "What do you think you're doing?" Warren sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. "Stay out of this, boy." Michael's eyes never wavered. He stepped closer to Warren, his voice now lowered, but still powerful. "You don't know what you're talking about. This kid did nothing wrong. But you've shown your true colors." For a brief moment, it was as if the world itself paused. The other passengers, who had been too afraid to speak, were now watching in rapt attention. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Would someone stand up for what was right? The flight attendants had backed away, sensing the tension but unsure how to intervene. This wasn't just about a minor conflict anymore. It was a confrontation about something much deeper, something that had been silently brewing in the air, undetected until now. "Do you really think you can treat a child like that?" Michael asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You've crossed a line, and I'm not going to sit back and watch it happen." Warren looked taken aback. His face reddened with embarrassment, but it didn't stop him from trying to muster a response. "What do you mean? This kid—" "No, you don't get to say anything more," Michael interrupted, his tone now sharp and uncompromising. "What you did wasn't just disrespectful, it was hateful. And it's about time someone told you that." The cabin held its collective breath. For the first time since the slap, people were standing up for Jordan. One passenger spoke up from the back of the plane. "He's right. That was wrong." Another added, "You can't treat people like that." Jordan felt a spark of hope light up inside him, something he hadn't felt since the slap. For the first time, he wasn't alone. The weight of that realization hit him hard, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. But still, he had to ask himself, what would you do if you witnessed this? Would you stand up? As the tension between Michael and Warren continued to simmer, Jordan knew that this wasn't just about one man standing up for him. It was about everyone who had ever been afraid to speak out, who had ever been told to stay silent. The real fight was far from over. And Jordan was about to find out what true courage looked like. The atmosphere in the cabin was charged, like static before a thunderstorm. Michael's firm stance against Warren had ignited a spark in the passengers, but the man sitting just a few rows ahead wasn't backing down. The slap may have been a shocking catalyst, but it was the verbal war that followed that turned the cabin into a battleground. Warren's face was flushed with anger, his chest heaving with indignation. He turned to Michael, sneering. "You think you can intimidate me, huh? Just because you're some... what? Some black guy trying to play the hero?" His words oozed contempt as he looked Michael up and down. Michael remained unfazed. "No, I think I'm just someone who knows the difference between right and wrong," he said coolly, his voice steady but resolute. Warren scoffed. "Well, here's the thing, pal. You don't know anything about me. I'm not the one who's out of line here. That kid deserved it. He probably thinks he can do whatever he wants just because he's sitting in the same seat as me." His eyes darted toward Jordan, who was still seated, his face a mask of confusion and hurt. The tension in the cabin only grew. Some passengers, who had been silent since the slap, now began murmuring under their breath, and a few even dared to speak up. "That's enough, man," one woman called out from the back. "You can't treat a kid like that." A few other voices joined in, murmuring agreement. But the majority of passengers remained quiet, too uncomfortable to engage. It was clear that Warren had crossed a line, but the hesitation in the room was palpable. Jordan could feel it too, the heavy weight of inaction pressing down on him. The idea of being stuck in this moment, this unbearable silence, felt suffocating. Michael's eyes, still locked on Warren's, softened just a little as he spoke again, but his tone was unwavering. "The problem with people like you," Michael said, "is that you think your anger justifies your behavior. But you're wrong. Racism doesn't have a place in this world, especially not here. Not on this flight, not anywhere." Warren let out a bitter laugh, turning to face the rest of the cabin. "Oh, so now everyone's got an opinion, huh? What? You all think I'm the bad guy now? It's his fault. He can't even control himself." Michael's voice dropped low, the words now carrying a weight that seemed to press on everyone's chest. "No, It's your fault for believing that you have the right to treat people like this. It's your fault for perpetuating hate with every breath you take." The cabin was silent again, but the silence was different this time. It wasn't the oppressive, stifling silence from before. It was a tension-filled quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Jordan looked around, his eyes wide, unsure of what to feel. Part of him was relieved that someone had finally stood up for him, but part of him was afraid. What if this escalated further? What if the situation got worse? Warren scoffed again, muttering something about entitled people. His anger seemed to grow with every word he spoke, but it was now clear that he wasn't getting the satisfaction he thought he would. The passengers who had previously been passive were beginning to shift in their seats, some even standing up to voice their support for Michael. "You're making a scene, buddy," someone called from a few rows behind. "You don't get to slap someone like that and get away with it." Warren's face twisted in rage, but he didn't have the words to fight back. Instead, he just glared, his face red, looking around the cabin like he was looking for someone to back him up. Michael's eyes softened slightly, but the anger in his voice didn't dissipate. "You can keep going with your tantrum if you want," Michael said. "But know this, you've already lost. The second you hit that kid, you lost. And the rest of us, we're not going to stand by and let that happen." Jordan felt a strange sense of solidarity at those words. For the first time, he wasn't alone. The quiet whispers of support from the other passengers were like a lifeline. But still, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Would Michael's intervention really be enough to stop the chaos? Warren looked like he was about to shout something back. But before he could, one of the flight attendants approached. She was young, probably in her late 20s, and though her face was tight with nervousness, there was a fierce determination in her eyes. "Sir, I need you to remain calm," she said firmly. "If you don't, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the plane when we land." Warren froze, taken aback by her boldness. For the first time, it seemed like the situation was slipping out of his control. His shoulders slumped as he looked around at the other passengers. No one was on his side. And that, Jordan realized, was the power of standing up for what's right. It wasn't about fighting back with fists. It was about fighting back with the truth, with integrity, and with courage. Michael had shown him that. The tension in the cabin began to subside, but it wasn't over yet. The flight wasn't even close to landing, and as Michael made his way back to his seat, Jordan couldn't help but feel a weight lifted from his chest. Would Michael's intervention be enough to stop the chaos? Only time would tell, but one thing was clear. What had just happened on this flight was more than just a confrontation. It was a turning point, a chance for the passengers to choose a side. After the confrontation, the atmosphere in the cabin was still thick with tension. The remaining leg of the flight seemed to drag on, the minutes stretching like hours. Jordan sat quietly, trying to process everything that had just happened. His cheek still burned where Warren's slap had landed, but the overwhelming sense of relief that Michael had stood up for him kept him from feeling completely defeated. Jordan's mom, still shaken, turned to him. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jordan nodded, though he wasn't sure how to answer. He wasn't okay. How could he be after what had just happened? But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. The seatbelt sign finally went off, and the plane began to make its descent toward Los Angeles. The other passengers slowly resumed their quiet activities, but the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air. No one could simply forget what they had just witnessed. As the plane began its descent, Jordan noticed Michael once again, this time sitting across from him in the aisle seat. Michael's posture was relaxed, but there was something in his eyes, a weariness, a sense of having lived through too many battles. Jordan hesitated for a moment before finally speaking. "Thank you," Jordan said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Michael looked up, meeting Jordan's gaze with a warm yet somber smile. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, his voice steady but soft. "It's just what's right." Jordan wasn't sure how to respond, but he nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude he couldn't quite put into words. Michael paused for a moment, then spoke again, his tone now gentler, almost as though he were deciding whether to share something deeply personal. "You're lucky," Michael continued. "Some people don't get that kind of help. But I've spent my life fighting for justice, for the people who didn't have a voice. I know what it's like to be overlooked, to be discriminated against." Jordan looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Michael took a deep breath. "I'm fighting a terminal illness," he said, his voice lower now, filled with a quiet vulnerability. "This flight? It might be my last chance to make a difference. I'm getting too old for this. But I've spent my life fighting against racial injustice. That's my legacy." The words struck Jordan deeply. Here was a man, fighting not just for justice, but for his own survival, standing up for people like him, even when time was running out. Michael continued. "What happened today wasn't just about you, Jordan. It was about all of us. It was about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. And you?" He paused and looked directly at Jordan, his eyes full of compassion. "You've got a responsibility now to carry that forward." Jordan swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" "Every day we get a chance to make things right, to fight for what's just, even when it's hard, even when people try to put us down. You've got the power to make a difference, Jordan. Don't waste it." The weight of his words hung in the air as the plane continued its descent. Michael's secret history was just the beginning. But what was to come next for Jordan, and for Michael, was far from over. The atmosphere inside the plane had shifted. The slap, the confrontation, and the words exchanged between Michael and Warren had left the entire cabin on edge. The tension that filled the air was thick, but something else had emerged, something stronger than the discomfort. It was a sense of justice. The flight attendants, having watched the altercation unfold, finally approached the scene. Their faces were tight, their eyes flicking back and forth between Michael and Warren. The younger flight attendant, a woman in her mid-20s, spoke first. "Sir," she said in a firm, though slightly tremulous voice, "we need to ask you to calm down. This is not acceptable." Warren shot her an icy glare, his face red with fury. "This isn't your business," he spat. "These people have no respect." But Michael wasn't about to let the situation slide. He stood tall, his posture commanding, his voice clear as he addressed the flight attendants. "No, this is my business, and it should be everyone's business. This man slapped a child in front of us all. It's not just a matter of calming down, it's about holding him accountable." The room fell silent. The passengers, who had been too fearful to speak up before, now began to murmur among themselves. Michael's words had sparked something in them. There was a stirring in the cabin, an unmistakable shift. "Sir," the flight attendant repeated, her voice firmer now, "we're going to have to ask you to exit the plane when we land. We cannot let this behavior go unaddressed." Warren opened his mouth to argue, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He looked around at the eyes now glaring at him from every direction. Passengers who had previously been too uncomfortable to speak up, now emboldened by Michael's intervention. Then, Michael stepped forward, putting a hand on the flight attendant's arm, signaling that he wasn't done. He turned his attention back to Warren, who had the audacity to sneer at the flight crew. "You might think you can intimidate everyone into silence," Michael said with a calm, unwavering tone. "But you're wrong. What you did wasn't just wrong because it was violent. It's wrong because it's based on ignorance. It's wrong because it was based on hate." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and a few passengers nodded in agreement. One man from the back of the plane spoke up, his voice shaking but firm. "I've had enough of this kind of behavior. It's time to take action." Jordan's heart swelled as he watched the scene unfold. For the first time, the feeling of powerlessness started to slip away. The strangers around him, people who had been silent before, were now speaking up. His mother, too, was no longer just sitting there in shock. She was holding his hand tightly, squeezing it, her eyes filled with gratitude. The flight crew, though initially hesitant, began to assert more authority. The senior attendant, a man in his 40s, walked up beside the younger flight attendant and took over. He leaned in close to Michael, his voice quieter now. "We appreciate your intervention, but we need to make sure the situation doesn't escalate further." Michael, however, wasn't backing down. "I'm not asking for him to be thrown out for just the slap. I'm asking for him to be held accountable for what he represents. Unchecked, unapologetic hatred. This man needs to face real consequences, not just be escorted off this plane." The senior attendant looked around the cabin, and for the first time, he saw not just passengers, but witnesses. The silence wasn't the passive silence of discomfort anymore. It was a collective silence, waiting for the right thing to be done. Finally, the attendant nodded. "We'll handle it," he said. "We'll take care of this. We'll make sure this is addressed with the proper authorities." Jordan couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was happening. The world was listening, and justice, however small, was being served. He had to keep pinching himself. He'd never thought he would see someone stand up for him like this. He felt as if his whole being had been liberated. As the attendant turned away to handle the situation with the rest of the crew, the mood in the cabin remained charged. The majority of passengers were now watching Warren with a newfound disgust. The man who had slapped Jordan was no longer a figure of authority or power in this confined space. He was just a coward exposed. Michael took a moment to step back and face Jordan, who had been silent, but watching the entire exchange with wide eyes. "Are you okay?" Michael asked softly, kneeling in front of him. Jordan nodded, not trusting his voice, and Michael placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Remember this moment, kid? This is what standing up looks like. What you just saw, that's what courage is." Jordan blinked back tears, the floodgates opening as the weight of what had happened began to sink in. His heart was pounding with a mix of emotions, relief, pride, and the deep knowledge that this was a defining moment for him. But Michael wasn't finished. "You didn't do anything wrong, Jordan," he said with quiet authority. "People like him, they need to be reminded that they don't control the narrative anymore. And you? You just witnessed what it looks like when someone stands up for what's right. You're stronger than you think." The flight crew had now taken their positions, and the tension in the cabin began to settle. It wasn't over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Jordan felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone. And neither were any of the other passengers who had stood up. As the plane began its final descent toward Los Angeles, the conflict wasn't over, but a sense of justice had been served, and the flight wasn't even over yet. The plane's descent felt too slow for Jordan. The tension that had built over the last hour was still hanging in the air, but now there was a feeling of impending resolution. The fight, though far from over, had shifted. Michael's courage had turned the tide, but not everyone on the plane felt the same relief. Warren sat rigid in his seat, his lips tight, eyes narrowed. His earlier outbursts were now replaced with a cold, simmering anger. He knew he had lost the battle. He wasn't the dominant figure he once believed himself to be, and that, to him, was unforgivable. Jordan's mother whispered to him, her voice still shaky, "I'm proud of you, baby. You stayed calm. You didn't let him get to you." Jordan nodded silently, his gaze fixed ahead. His mom's voice gave him comfort, but it didn't erase the sting. Even though Michael had stood up for him, even though the flight attendants had taken charge, the shame still clung to him. The slap, the humiliation, the anger in Warren's voice. It was hard to shake. Michael, however, wasn't done with the lesson. "Jordan, listen," he said, his voice low but strong. "You don't owe anyone an explanation for what happened. People like Warren don't need a reason to hate. But you don't need to be defined by what people like him say or do. You're stronger than that." Jordan turned to face him, his eyes searching. "But what if they keep doing it? What if nothing ever changes?" Michael sighed, his expression softening. "Change doesn't come all at once. You can't fix the world in a day, but you can change your corner of it. And you've got a voice. You've got power. You just saw what happens when someone uses theirs." Jordan looked at Michael, then around the cabin. The passengers who had spoken up, who had taken sides, they weren't just passive bystanders anymore. They had acted. They had made a difference. "Do you think this is enough?" Jordan asked, still unsure. "Do you think anything will happen to him?" Michael nodded. "What matters is that you know, and they know, that there's more power in standing up than staying silent. Justice doesn't always come right away, but it's always worth fighting for." The plane landed soon after, the roar of the engines signaling the end of the flight and the beginning of a much larger fight for justice. As the flight continued, the previously tense atmosphere began to shift. The anger that had been festering in the cabin seemed to dissipate, replaced by something stronger, a sense of unity. The plane, though still confined in its narrow space, felt a little larger now. The passengers who had been passive observers moments ago were now speaking out, rallying behind Jordan and Michael. From the back of the plane, a woman in her 30s stood up and raised her voice. "What happened wasn't right. We all saw it. No one should be treated like that." A murmur of agreement rippled through the aisles. More voices joined in, each one more assured than the last. "He didn't deserve that," someone else called out. "No one does." Jordan looked around in stunned silence. For the first time since the slap, he wasn't just a victim of an incident. He was part of something much bigger. His eyes met his mother's, who was still holding his hand. But now there was a different look in her eyes, one of pride and gratitude. She squeezed his hand, as if silently saying, "This is what standing up looks like." Michael, standing tall in the aisle, surveyed the room. His eyes softened as he observed the shift that had taken place. What had once been a flight filled with silent tension was now a plane full of voices, voices that refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. "See, Jordan?" Michael's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a lesson. "It only takes one person to spark a fire, and when enough people stand together, no one can ignore it." Jordan nodded slowly, still processing the change around him. They were standing up for him. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. The flight attendant returned to the aisle, addressing the passengers. "We will be taking action. The situation is being handled. Thank you to everyone who spoke up." We'll ensure proper protocol is followed. But even with the flight crew trying to restore order, the air still buzzed with energy. People were talking, not just about what happened, but about the broader issue. A young man in the seat next to Michael leaned forward. "I never thought about it like that. That guy, Warren, he didn't just do something wrong to Jordan. He did it to all of us. He thought he could get away with it." Michael looked at him and smiled softly. "That's the thing, my friend. These things don't just affect one person. They affect all of us. And if we don't stand up for what's right, who will?" As the voices around the cabin began to quiet, Jordan felt something stir inside him. The tightness in his chest that had been there since the slap started to loosen. The anger and shame that had initially consumed him faded, replaced by something more powerful. The realization that his voice, too, mattered. For the first time, Jordan understood the power of words. Michael had shown him that one person's words could stop an injustice, and when those words were backed by a community, they could become a force to be reckoned with. "Thank you," Jordan whispered to Michael, his voice hoarse but filled with gratitude. Michael nodded, his eyes gleaming with quiet pride. "You've got a voice, Jordan. Don't forget that." As the plane flew on, Jordan sat back in his seat, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. He wasn't just a passive observer anymore. He was a part of something bigger, a movement, however small, toward justice and equality. The cabin, now buzzing with solidarity, wasn't just a space on an airplane anymore. It was a reminder. When we speak out, when we support each other, change becomes possible. The descent of the plane was a slow, deliberate process. The engines whirred as the aircraft lowered toward the tarmac, but in Jordan's mind, the world felt like it was moving faster. His thoughts raced as he tried to grasp everything that had happened, everything he had just witnessed. The tension, though still palpable, was now tempered with anticipation. As the flight crew moved about, it became clear that action was finally being taken. A few minutes before the plane landed, a uniformed officer entered the cabin. The man, tall and stern, immediately went straight to the front of the plane, where Warren Caldwell sat, still stewing in his anger, his face flushed with humiliation. "We need you to come with us," the officer said, his voice firm and unyielding. Warren's eyes darted around the cabin, looking for some shred of support, but there was none. The passengers who had once looked on in stunned silence were now standing with their arms crossed, glancing at him with disdain. The man who had once carried himself like he owned the world now looked like a cornered animal with nowhere to go. "I didn't do anything wrong," Warren muttered, his voice rising with indignation. "This is all blown out of proportion." The officer didn't flinch. "You slapped a child. That's assault. You're coming with us." Jordan's breath caught in his throat as he watched the scene unfold. His heart pounded with a mix of relief and disbelief. This wasn't the resolution he'd expected. He thought there might be some slap on the wrist or a passive resolution, but this was real. Justice was happening in front of him. As the officer led Warren off the plane, Michael stood silently, observing the scene with a calm resolve. The confrontation had ended, but Michael's work wasn't over. He turned toward Jordan's mother, who had been quietly watching the entire exchange. Her face was still pale, but there was a new light in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice full of gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Michael shrugged, a humble smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Jordan, now standing next to his mother, looked up at Michael. "Are you a hero?" he asked, his voice still small but full of wonder. Michael chuckled, the sound warm and reassuring. I'm no hero, kid. I'm just a man who's seen too much and decided to do something about it. We all have the power to be heroes in our own way. As the plane landed and the flight attendants prepared for passengers to deboard, the cabin was still buzzing with the aftermath of what had transpired. People who had been strangers a few hours ago were now looking at each other differently. They shared glances of solidarity, of understanding. In that confined space, the issue of racial injustice had sparked an irreversible shift. Before they left the plane, Michael pulled Jordan aside. "Remember this moment," he said. "Remember that the power of standing up, of speaking out, can change things. The road won't always be easy, but if we keep fighting, things will get better." Jordan nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle into his soul. This wasn't just about the slap anymore. It wasn't just about Warren. It was about something much bigger, something that he could feel stirring inside him. As they exited the plane, Jordan's mother turned to Michael. "What can we do next?" she asked, her voice hopeful. "How can we keep this going?" Michael's smile was genuine, but there was a sense of urgency in his eyes. "Keep speaking out. Keep standing up. Change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It takes all of us." As the passengers filed off the plane, Jordan felt a sense of empowerment that would stay with him for the rest of his life. This wasn't just a fight for him. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been silenced. And it was a fight that, thanks to people like Michael, was just beginning. The journey had only begun, but the change was already happening. As the airplane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport, the rush of excitement Jordan had felt earlier began to fade into something more complex. The bustling terminal, the overhead announcements, the whir of rolling suitcases. It all felt so distant now, like the world had moved on, but Jordan remained frozen in that moment on Flight 1742. He had stood up to injustice. He had witnessed the raw power of solidarity, yet, in the midst of all that empowerment, there was still a weight on his chest, an unfamiliar heaviness that refused to leave him. As they exited the jet bridge, Jordan walked beside his mother, who kept glancing at him, trying to gauge his emotions. She hadn't asked him how he was feeling yet, but Jordan could see it in her eyes. The concern, the unspoken question of whether he was all right after everything that had happened. "Jordan, are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice more fragile than usual. He nodded, but didn't answer immediately. He wanted to be okay. He should be okay. After all, Michael had stood up for him, the passengers had rallied behind him, and Warren Caldwell had been escorted off the plane in disgrace. This was a victory. His victory, right? But the truth was, the slap, the words, the weight of it all were still there, festering in the back of his mind. As they made their way to baggage claim, Jordan's eyes drifted to the floor. His thoughts were a jumble. He had been humiliated in front of so many people, not just by Warren, but by the world. And now he had to deal with the aftermath, the emotional toll that would stay with him long after this moment had passed. "Mom, it's just—" "I don't know," Jordan murmured. "I feel weird, empowered, but also confused." His mother gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, baby. What you experienced wasn't easy. You don't have to have all the answers right now. It's about growth, and that takes time." Just then, Michael walked up behind them, a quiet presence that seemed to cut through the noise of the terminal. He had been lingering in the background, waiting until the right moment. His voice was calm, but firm when he spoke. "I saw you, Jordan. You stood your ground. That's something not everyone gets the chance to do." Jordan looked up at Michael. seeing something in his eyes he hadn't noticed before, a kind of deep, knowing respect. Michael continued, "You know, when I first started fighting for what's right, I didn't think it would matter. I didn't think I could change anything. But then I realized it wasn't just about one moment. It was about creating a ripple. It's about leaving behind a legacy, something for the next generation to build on." Jordan processed the words slowly. He understood what Michael meant, but it was hard to fully grasp. Legacy. He wasn't sure he had ever thought about it that way. He had simply acted, driven by the deep sense that what happened to him wasn't just wrong. It was part of a larger systemic issue. Michael's voice softened. "One day, you'll look back on this moment and you'll see it differently. You'll see that it was more than just standing up to one man. It was about showing others what it means to speak up." Jordan stared at Michael, his mind whirling. He hadn't asked for any of this. But now, in the wake of what had happened, he couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to decide what kind of person he was going to be. "Thanks," Jordan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what it means, having you here today. You're right. This is bigger than just me." Michael smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I wish it didn't have to be this way, but sometimes we have to fight the battles that choose us. Just remember, the fight isn't over. It's never over." As Jordan and his mother walked out of the airport and into the warm California sunlight, he felt a mixture of emotions. There was still uncertainty, still that weight of the incident he couldn't shake. But alongside it was something else, a new sense of strength, of purpose, of understanding that what had happened on that flight wasn't just his fight. It was everyone's fight. Have you ever had a moment where you stood up for what was right? What changed for you afterward? The world didn't stay quiet for long. Within hours of the flight landing, news of the incident spread like wildfire. The story broke on social media platforms, shared across multiple news outlets, and soon, Flight 1742 became a topic of national conversation. At first, Jordan's family had no idea how far-reaching the event would become. It seemed surreal, how one moment a slap in the face could spark such a wave of outrage. But it wasn't just the slap, it was the whole situation. The abuse Jordan had endured, the bravery Michael had shown, and the power of those who stood up and spoke out. The media ran with the story. Headlines screamed about the shocking incident of racism on Flight 1742 and "Hero passenger confronts racist man mid-flight." The video footage, shot by an anonymous passenger, had gone viral within hours. Warren Caldwell, now the face of corporate entitlement and unchecked racism, became the villain of the moment. The online response was overwhelming. People from all over the world voiced their support for Jordan and Michael. Thousands of comments flooded in, praising Michael's courage and condemning Warren's actions. But there was a darker side to the story, too. Trolls, racist remarks, and individuals defending Warren's behavior. They were quickly drowned out by the wave of solidarity, but their voices still lingered in the background. As Jordan watched the growing online firestorm, he felt an odd mixture of vindication and fear. This was real. The whole world was watching now. He had never imagined his story would become this public, this explosive. Meanwhile, Warren Caldwell was facing the consequences of his actions. Law enforcement was now involved, and the airline had issued an official statement condemning his behavior. He was detained upon landing and escorted off the plane by airport security. There were talks of potential charges against him for assault and harassment. The company he worked for issued a formal apology, distancing themselves from his actions, but many questioned whether this was enough. But Warren wasn't the only one with a secret. Jordan learned through the media that Warren's past wasn't as spotless as he had let on. A former employee of his came forward, alleging that Warren had a long history of racially biased behavior at work. The more details emerged, the clearer it became. This wasn't an isolated incident. Warren's actions were part of a larger, more sinister pattern that extended beyond this one flight. The story grew even darker. It was revealed that Warren's privilege had shielded him for years, but now there was nowhere left to hide. Michael, in an interview with a local news station, spoke passionately about the systemic nature of racism and the need for people to step up and make a difference. This isn't just about one man's actions. It's about a larger fight for equality, for dignity, for respect, he said. We all have a responsibility to fight for justice, especially when it's uncomfortable. For Jordan, this was all a lot to process. He couldn't help but wonder, was it over? Was Warren really going to face the consequences of his actions? It didn't feel like it was finished. But in that moment, he felt the shift that had begun on the plane, a shift that was now shaking the foundations of how people thought about racism, justice, and the power of speaking out. Shocking twist. But there was one thing Warren didn't know. He wasn't the only one with a secret. A few days after the flight, life seemed to return to some semblance of normalcy. But for Jordan and Michael, nothing was quite the same. The world had shifted in ways they couldn't fully grasp, and the bond between them had deepened. Michael had become more than just the stranger who had stood up for Jordan on that flight. He had become a mentor, a guiding force. They'd exchanged phone numbers, and ever since, Michael had reached out to Jordan, offering words of encouragement, checking in, and talking about life, about fighting injustice, and about standing up for what was right. It was on one of those calls a few days later that Michael opened up to Jordan. They were sitting in a park, their feet buried in the grass, the sun peeking through the trees. Michael's usually confident demeanor softened, and he spoke in a voice that held the weight of years of experience. "I didn't always have the luxury of standing up for people, Jordan," Michael said, looking at the horizon. "I lost a lot. People I loved, because of this fight. My family, my friends, some of them didn't make it because of the very thing we just confronted. Racism, hate, privilege." Jordan listened closely, the weight of Michael's words sinking in. He had always been aware of racial injustice, but hearing Michael speak from personal experience gave him a new perspective. The idea that these issues weren't just about isolated moments, but about deep generational pain, left him feeling both heavy and inspired. "I lost my sister, you know. To hate," Michael continued, his voice thick with emotion. "She was young, only a few years older than you. We were close. She was in a fight. Nothing physical, just words, just the way people treated her because she was black, because she dared to ask for respect. She never made it out of that fight, Jordan. She died trying to make people see her worth." Jordan's heart sank. He couldn't imagine the pain Michael must have felt, losing someone so close. But Michael wasn't done. "I tell you this not for pity, but so you know. You're fighting a battle that matters. It's bigger than you and me. It's about everyone who's been oppressed, everyone who's been silenced. It's a fight that's been going on for generations, and it's not going to end just because of one confrontation. But it can start with one moment of courage." Jordan, who had once felt unsure of himself, now felt a fire ignite within him. He understood. It wasn't just about speaking up in that one moment on the plane. It was about using that moment to create change, to be part of something much bigger than himself. "You're right," Jordan said, his voice steadier now. "It's not just about me. It's about everyone who has to go through this every day." Michael nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. You're going to change the world, Jordan. You have to believe that. You have the strength, the voice, and the courage. Just keep standing up. It's not about being loud. It's about being heard. Jordan's thoughts raced. He realized then that his journey was just beginning. The injustice he had faced wasn't something to bury deep and forget. It was something to carry with him, something to fight for, just as Michael had done, just as so many others had done before him. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation heavy in the air. Jordan felt a new sense of purpose blooming inside him. He was ready to be part of something bigger, ready to be a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Do you have a mentor who has guided you through tough times? How have they helped you grow? Back in the public eye, Warren Caldwell was no longer the well-respected businessman he once had been. The backlash from his actions on Flight 1742 had been swift and unforgiving. His name was splashed across every media outlet, and the public's fury was palpable. Warren's first attempt at justifying his behavior came through a series of interviews that only deepened the public's contempt. He called his actions a misunderstanding, claiming that the incident had been blown out of proportion. But the damage had already been done. In one interview, he tried to downplay the slap as a momentary lapse in judgment, but his words only revealed the true depth of his entitlement and ignorance. His dismissive tone made it clear that he felt no real remorse for what had happened. In fact, he tried to paint himself as the victim, claiming that his respectable actions had been misunderstood and that Jordan's behavior had been disrespectful. The more Warren spoke, the more he alienated himself from public sympathy. His statements were riddled with coded language and condescension, and he failed to acknowledge the racial undertones of his actions. The more he tried to justify his behavior, the more people saw the truth. Warren was a man blinded by his privilege, one who had never once been forced to confront his own biases. As the media frenzy grew, legal action loomed on the horizon. The airline took swift action, cutting all ties with him. There were calls for his arrest, and eventually he was charged with assault. He also faced multiple lawsuits from passengers who had witnessed the attack, and the ripple effect from his actions began to hit him where it hurt the most: his business. Warren's company, once a staple in the corporate world, quickly distanced itself from him. His business partners, fearing their own reputations would be tarnished, cut ties and publicly condemned his behavior. His name was no longer associated with success. It was now synonymous with bigotry and violence. But what stung the most, perhaps, was the public's rejection of him. His image, once polished and admired, was now forever tarnished. Social media was alive with hashtags like Warren the Racist, Justice for Jordan, and Stand Up, Speak Out, each post further eroding his public standing. It became clear that, while the world may have been silent in the face of his racism for years, it would no longer tolerate it. Warren had never expected his life to unravel so quickly. His privileged world, one built on power and influence, was crumbling before his eyes. And yet, in the midst of it all, he failed to see the real cost of his actions, the lives he had hurt, the people he had offended, and the injustice he had perpetuated. Meanwhile, Jordan's family had their own reckoning to face. The situation was far from over. The press had turned its attention to them as well, and Jordan found himself struggling to navigate the newfound attention. Though he was empowered by the support he had received, he also felt the weight of the spotlight on him. It was strange, being at the center of a national conversation about racism and justice, when all he had wanted was to live a quiet life. But the truth was, this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, who had ever suffered in the face of discrimination, It was about the future, and about making sure that what had happened on Flight 1742 would never be forgotten. Should people like Warren be held accountable for their actions? What's the price of privilege? Months passed since that life-altering flight, and although the world had moved on, the ripple effect of that one moment continued to resonate through Jordan's life. The plane had landed, but the battle against racism had just begun for him. Michael Kavach had changed everything for Jordan: his perspective, his goals, and the way he viewed the world. As the months wore on, Michael's health, which had been frail even during their encounter on the flight, continued to deteriorate. It was no secret that Michael had been fighting a terminal illness. Jordan had known this, but the weight of it still struck him hard every time they spoke. Even with his declining health, Michael remained a beacon of strength. He stayed in touch with Jordan, offering guidance, encouragement, and words of wisdom. Their conversations were deep and meaningful, with Michael pushing Jordan to continue fighting, not just for himself, but for the future. But as time went on, Michael's health deteriorated, and their calls grew shorter, less frequent. Jordan found himself looking at Michael not just as a mentor, but as a hero. Someone who had sacrificed so much, someone who had lived a life defined by courage and perseverance. One evening, Jordan sat in his room, holding a letter Michael had written to him before his condition worsened. Michael spoke about his hopes for Jordan, his belief that the young man had the power to create real change. "You're more than what this world has tried to make you," Michael wrote, "and you'll do things I only wish I could have done." Tears filled Jordan's eyes as he reread the letter. He was no longer the frightened, confused teenager he had been on that flight. He had grown, matured, and found a sense of purpose that was deeply rooted in the lessons Michael had imparted. He could feel Michael's legacy living on in him. One day, Jordan found himself standing before a group of students at his school, just like Michael had done for him when they first met. He stood at a podium, nervously gripping the edges, but a sense of confidence filled his chest. He wasn't speaking to the students. He was speaking for justice. He was speaking for the people whose voices had been silenced by ignorance and hate. "Change doesn't come from silence," Jordan said, his voice firm but shaking. "It comes from standing up, even when you're scared. Even when it feels like no one else will. Michael showed me that. And he would have wanted me to tell you all. Don't let your fear silence you. Use your voice. Use your actions." As the words flowed from his lips, Jordan felt a shift inside him. He realized that the power Michael had given him wasn't just a tool for his own growth. It was a tool for the world, a tool to fight against the hate and racism that still existed in every corner of society. Jordan wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for everyone who had been wronged, for everyone who had faced discrimination, for everyone who had been told they weren't good enough. Michael had passed away shortly after their last conversation, but his legacy had taken root in Jordan's heart. And Jordan knew, without a doubt, that he would carry that legacy forward, one story at a time. Jordan's journey was just beginning. Years had passed since the fateful flight that changed everything. Jordan was no longer the young, uncertain boy he had once been. Now, as a young adult, he stood in front of crowds, speaking about the power of standing up for what's right and fighting for racial justice. He had become an advocate, a voice for those who had once been silenced, just as Michael had done for him. But the road wasn't easy. Even with his newfound strength, Jordan still faced challenges: racism, microaggressions, and prejudice. It was a harsh reminder that the world wasn't perfect and that the fight was far from over. Jordan had made his peace with the fact that things wouldn't change overnight, but he also knew that his purpose was bigger than himself. One afternoon, Jordan was invited to speak at a local event, a gathering for high school students. He stood in front of the crowd, a mixture of eager faces and skeptical stares. He could feel the weight of the moment, the responsibility he now carried on his shoulders. As he looked out into the crowd, he saw students who reminded him of his younger self, lost, confused, unsure of their place in the world. His voice wavered at first, but soon it found its rhythm. He shared his story, the story of the plane, of Michael's intervention, of the lessons that had changed his life. He spoke of Michael's death, of the void left by his mentor, but also of the fire that had been ignited within him. "I was just a kid when I first saw someone stand up for what was right," Jordan said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But now I stand here with all of you, and I want you to know, it's your turn. It's your turn to speak up. It's your turn to fight for what's right." He paused for a moment, looking around the room. "I know it's not always easy. I know it's not always comfortable. But nothing worth having ever comes easy. I didn't ask for my journey, but it's the one I've been given. And now I have the power to make a difference. And so do you." Jordan's words hung in the air. He had once been that kid, unsure of himself, unsure of the world around him. But now, as he stood before this group of students, he felt the weight of his purpose. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for a generation, for those who had been oppressed and forgotten. After the event, Jordan received messages from students, sharing their own stories of discrimination and injustice. Some had faced racism in their schools, others in their neighborhoods. They thanked Jordan for his courage and his words. It was in these moments, in the quiet conversations that followed his speeches, that Jordan understood the true power of his voice. It wasn't about just speaking out in front of large crowds. It was about reaching people, one by one, and inspiring them to take action in their own lives. As he continued his work, Jordan never forgot the lessons Michael had taught him. He knew the journey wasn't over, that there would always be more battles to fight. But he also knew that with each step he took, he was making the world a little bit better. And that was enough. What is one thing you've learned from facing adversity? Michael's condition had worsened. His time was running out, and every day felt heavier for those who knew him. But even in his final days, he remained a beacon of strength for those around him. Jordan, who had learned so much from Michael over the past few years, now found himself in the position of supporting his mentor through one of the most difficult times of his life. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of machines. Michael was lying in the bed, his face pale but still carrying that indomitable spirit that had guided Jordan for so long. Jordan sat by his side, holding his hand, knowing that the man who had been his guiding light was now closer to the end than either of them wanted to admit. "You've made a difference, Jordan," Michael said, his voice weak but steady. "But the real work, the real change, it's in the hands of the next generation. The world needs more people who aren't afraid to stand up. You understand that now, don't you?" Jordan nodded, fighting back tears. Michael had been more than a mentor to him. He had been a father figure, a role model, and a friend. The lessons he had imparted over the years had transformed Jordan into someone who was no longer afraid to speak out, to challenge injustice, and to demand change. Michael's eyes fluttered, but he forced a smile. "Remember, the fight doesn't end with me. It's never been about me. It's about the future. It's about what you do next. You're not alone in this fight, Jordan. Don't ever forget that." Michael's words hung in the air, heavier than the machines that surrounded him. It was as though he was passing the torch to Jordan, entrusting him with a legacy that was larger than either of them had imagined. Jordan realized with a sudden and overwhelming clarity that this wasn't the end. This was just another beginning, one that Michael had fought for, one that Jordan now had to continue. Later that day, as Jordan left the hospital, the weight of Michael's words stayed with him. He knew that he had been given the greatest gift of all, the power to change the world. And while Michael might not be there physically, his influence would continue through Jordan's actions. Jordan stood at the crossroads of his life, facing the world with the strength and conviction Michael had instilled in him. Michael's death, though deeply painful, became a final lesson in resilience. It was the lesson that life wasn't just about surviving the obstacles. It was about using those obstacles to create a better world for the generations that would follow. As Jordan walked away from the hospital, his mind was made up. He would carry Michael's legacy forward, and in doing so, he would inspire others to stand up, speak out, and make a difference, just as Michael had done for him. What's the legacy you want to leave behind? Jordan's journey, one he never expected, was now in full motion. As the years passed, he grew not just in knowledge but in purpose. The lessons from Michael had shaped him into a strong advocate, a voice for change. He had been present during a moment that had altered the course of his life, but now it was time for him to create his own legacy. Jordan had become involved in numerous social justice initiatives, fighting for racial equality, combating discrimination, and addressing systemic issues in his community. The momentum he had built was undeniable, and it was clear that his influence was growing. But despite all the progress, Jordan knew there was still work to be done. He stood in front of a crowd, a mixture of young activists, students, and professionals, all gathered for an event focused on racial justice. As he spoke, Jordan felt the weight of the responsibility that had been placed on him. His words were strong, his passion undeniable. "The road ahead won't be easy," Jordan said, his voice steady, "but we're in this together. Every single one of us has the power to make a difference. It's not about waiting for change. It's about being the change." The audience listened intently, nodding, clapping, and sharing in his vision. Jordan spoke from experience, not as someone who had merely read about injustice, but as someone who had lived it, fought against it, and overcome it. Yet, even as Jordan looked around at the faces of his supporters, he couldn't help but think about the lessons Michael had taught him, the importance of standing up, of not being silent in the face of injustice. It was Michael's unwavering courage that had inspired him to step up, and it was that same courage that would drive him to keep going, no matter the obstacles in his way. As the event came to a close, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The issues he was addressing were deeply entrenched, and progress was slow. But with every speech, every protest, and every conversation, he knew they were making a dent. The world was beginning to change, slowly but surely, and Jordan was at the forefront of that change. But even with all the progress, there was still the nagging feeling that there was more to be done. Jordan's eyes looked ahead beyond the crowd to the future. He knew that the road wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. He had learned from the best, and now it was his turn to lead. As he stepped off the stage, a quiet moment of reflection swept over him. He had come a long way from the frightened teen on that airplane. He had seen injustice up close, had faced it, and had learned to fight back. He had become a leader, not because he sought the role, but because the world needed people like him. And while Michael was no longer there, Jordan felt his presence in every step he took. Michael's teachings had lived on in him, and now it was his turn to pass those lessons on to others. Change, he knew, wouldn't happen overnight. But together, with the community he had found and the strength of those around him, he was confident that it was possible. The fight wasn't over, but Jordan now knew that together, change was possible.